Have you ever believed that? There is a child who can scare everyone with just a smile. If one day you entered a luxurious mansion where every maid ran away in fear just because a 3-year-old boy bit you until you bled, would you have the courage to stay in that house? The father, a cold, successful billionaire, lived with his only son in obsession and guilt. The boy did not speak, did not laugh, only cried and fought back anyone who touched him. Until a girl came. No power, no wealth, just a warm heart and a determined gaze. She didn't run away when bitten. She wasn't scared by the screams. Instead of the little monster everyone talked about, she saw only a child in pain. And from that moment on, the boy smiled for the first time. But if you were that father, between fame, fear, and trust, what would you choose? Dare to trust a stranger, or continue to hide in your own loss? Today's story is not just about a child's smile, but about how people find the light again after losing faith in love. Please listen to the story. Every nanny quit after the millionaire's son bit them, but then he smiled at One Maid. If you feel your heart fluttering, like, share this video, and subscribe to Frontier Hearts so you never miss out on more soul-touching stories like this one. There was a quietness all of its own in suburban Portland, a silence so thick you could hear the rustle of dead leaves on the porch. But in the old stone mansion on Westmore Hill, that silence was suddenly shattered by a scream. A woman rushed down the stairs, her left hand holding her right arm, which was bleeding. Her white apron was stained red. She threw open the door and rushed out into the rain, her voice trembling. No one can look after that child. No one. The old housekeeper, Mrs. Langley, stood stunned in the doorway, her eyes full of fear. As soon as the door closed, a low, hoarse cry resounded from within the house. The voice of a child. On the second floor, Richard Hale stood silently, a man of 40, his hair streaked with silver, wearing a black sweater. His eyes looked wearily down the dark hallway. The door at the end of the row shook slightly with a knock. Inside, Noah, his 3-year-old son, was screaming and throwing toys to the floor. Richard did not move closer. He just stood there, his hands hanging limply, like a man accustomed to helplessness. "Come on, Noah," he said softly, his voice low and laced with pain. "Daddy's here." The boy didn't respond, just curled up in the corner of the room, his eyes wide and filled with fear. On the walls were dusty family photos, a picture of a smiling blonde woman hugging Noah, his wife, Elena, who had died in a car accident nearly 2 years ago. Since that day, the house that was once full of laughter now only has echoes. A psychiatrist had advised Richard to take his son to a therapy center, but he refused. He didn't want his son to become a case study. He believed that somehow he could help Noah. He just didn't know where to start. Noah was a bright child, always running to the door when he heard his mother's car. That day, instead of smiles, he heard the clang of metal and the siren of an ambulance. Since then, Noah has been silent, and when someone tries to come near, he bites. 13 nurses came and went. Some lasted weeks, some only hours. Now the town was saying, "The Hale child is haunted." Richard knew it was a stupid thing to say, but on rainy nights like this, standing alone in his 4,000-square-foot room, watching the light reflect through the large windows, he wondered, was this house swallowing their souls? Mrs. Langley stepped forward and put her hand on his shoulder. "Mr. Hale, I called the housekeeping company. They said they would send someone tomorrow morning. But it's okay, he replied softly. Let them try. She hesitated. The boy. He needs someone who is not afraid of him. But finding someone like that is not easy. Richard pursed his lips. He knew she was right. He, the father, was still afraid to step through his son's bedroom door. When Mrs. Langley left, Richard stood by the stairs, looking toward Noah's room. The nightlight cast a faint yellow glow across the old patterned carpet from the crack in the door. In that moment, he thought of Elena. He remembered the night she died. He was at an investor meeting in Seattle, 170 miles away. When he got to the hospital, he could only hold her cold hand. He bowed his head and whispered softly as if to the deceased, "I'm sorry. I don't know how to do this alone." A gust of wind swept through the hallway, carrying with it the sound of delicate weeping. Richard turned away, gripping the stair railing, and in that moment he knew tomorrow, when the new person arrived, it might all fail again. But he had to try, because if he didn't, he would lose Noah completely. Outside, it was still raining in Portland. Distant city lights reflected off the mist like stray stars. And in the mansion on the hill, two people, father and son, were locked in separate rooms, just a few feet apart, but worlds apart. Richard looked toward his son's room one last time. He spoke softly, as if promising, "Tomorrow, you won't cry alone. Noah?" The next morning, Portland was still covered in a fine mist of rain. Fog blanketed the streets around Westmore Hill, turning the hill into a white blur. The Hale house was silent, except for the wind tapping softly against the large windows. When the clock struck 7, the minibus stopped in front of the iron gate. The door opened, and a woman stepped out. She wore a dark brown coat, and over her shoulder slung an old, frayed canvas bag. Her black hair was tied back at the nape of her neck. A few strands wet from the rain stuck to her cheeks. She raised her head, looking at the villa hidden in the mist, her eyes showing no fear, only a calm, mature look. Her name is Grace Miller. She stopped at the tall iron gates, the cold metal seeping through her palms as she pressed the bell. A few seconds later, the door opened, and Mrs. Langley emerged, wearing a gray sweater, her eyes searching. "Are you from the company?" she asked, her voice wary. Grace nodded. "Yes, I'm Grace Miller. They said they needed a temporary cleaner and housekeeper." Mrs. Langley looked her up and down, then opened the gate wider. "Come in. I'm not sure you know what you're walking into." Grace smiled slightly at that. "I've heard things like that before, but every house has its reasons for being sad, right?" The housekeeper paused. No one had ever spoken to her like that before. Grace stepped inside, her shoes making a low, steady sound on the damp stone. The mansion became clearer. Through the mist, the large windows, the rusted railing, the dead rose trellis along the walkway. Everything was beautiful, but cold. As she stepped through the doorway, she felt a strange tension in the air, as if the house were holding its breath. The living room was large, with high ceilings and landscape paintings on the walls, but the light pouring in did not warm it. Grace looked around, her hand lightly touching the polished oak table. Everything was so perfect, it was lifeless. "Mr. Hale isn't up yet," Mrs. Langley said, pouring tea. "He's been working all night. The baby's still asleep, or pretending to be. In any case, don't go upstairs. The room at the end of the hall. Just remember not to go in." Grace tilted her head slightly. "I understand. I'm just doing my job." The housekeeper looked at her for a moment, then nodded. The study, kitchen, and living room are downstairs. I'll show you how to operate the heating and laundry. Everything here is to the master standards precise, punctual, and absolutely clean. Grace followed her grandmother down the long hallways. With every step, she felt as if the house were watching her, not with its eyes, but with its memories. When they reached the kitchen, Mrs. Langley left to call the plumber. Grace stood, looking out the window. The rain was still falling quietly. She opened her bag and took out a small photograph, her and a curly-haired girl, both smiling brightly. The photo was slightly creased, with a coffee stain on the top corner. She stroked the child's face gently. "You'll like this place, Emily," she whispered. "Quiet, like you dreamed." A soft sound came from above, like a box lid falling, then a soft tapping, regular, insistent, like small hands tapping on wood. Grace raised her head. On the second floor, the hallway was dark, the morning light barely reaching. She stood still, listening carefully, the thin cry like a thread, shattered in the air. "Don't go up there, Mrs." Langley's words echoed in her head, but the cry wasn't angry. It was an exhausted sound. Grace put the photo down and took a deep breath. She knew the feeling of a child calling someone who didn't come. Outside, the shutters banged loudly, making the wind chimes jingle. Grace walked toward the stairs. Each wooden step creaked softly. The second-floor hallway was long and dark, with only a single window at the end casting a dim light onto the floor. The door at the end of the hallway was ajar. From inside, sobbing continued to echo. Grace paused in the doorway, her palms sweating. For a moment, she felt like she was back in time, the old hospital where she used to work. She remembered the little girl who had died during her shift. She remembered the pain in her mother's eyes. It was the incident that had cost her her job, her reputation, and almost her faith. She took a deep breath and knocked softly. "Hi, I'm Grace. I just want to get the mop. I'm lost." No one answered, only heavy breathing. She gently pushed the door open a crack. In the dim light, she saw the boy crouched on the floor, surrounded by broken toys. Noah's big, black eyes looked at her, both scared and curious. Grace didn't go in. She just sat down in the doorway, a few feet away from him. "I know this room is a little cold. There are cookies in the kitchen. I'll leave some on the table. If you want, you can come down and eat with me." The boy said nothing, but the crying stopped. Grace sat still, not forcing herself. She looked around the room, the pale blue of the walls, the small bed, a child's blanket embroidered with the letter N. Dust covered everything. In that moment, she felt something very strange, as if the room, though silent, was holding its breath along with the child. Heavy footsteps sounded downstairs. Richard had just woken up. He walked across the hallway and saw Grace sitting by his son's door. He froze. "What are you doing here?" His voice was hoarse, tinged with caution. Grace turned back, her eyes calm. "I heard you crying. I just wanted to make sure you were okay." Richard frowned. "I told you no one is to come into this room." "Don't you understand?" Grace stood up and looked him straight in the eye. "I understand, sir. But sometimes being locked out is a way to make the fear greater. Sometimes just having someone sit outside is all it takes." He was silent. It was the first time someone had spoken to him like that, without servility, without pity, just with all their heart. "Finally," he said softly, "come down. Mrs. Langley will show you the job. I don't want Noah getting any more excited." Grace nodded and turned away. But before she closed the door, she heard the boy say a very small sound like the wind. It was unclear if it was Mommy or Auntie. She stopped, smiled slightly, and then walked down the stairs. Behind him, Noah's room door closed, but it was no longer completely silent, like before. Outside, the rain had stopped, a thin light shining through the glass windows. Grace placed a plate of freshly baked cookies on the kitchen table, the warm buttery scent filling the air. Little did she know, from upstairs, small eyes were looking down, following that scent, for the first time in months, not in fear, but in curiosity. Monday morning in the villa began with familiar sounds, the sound of rain on the eaves, the steady hum of the coffee maker in the kitchen, and the soft footsteps on the second-floor wooden floor. But today, unlike any other day, there was no crying. Instead, there was an unusual silence, both fragile and hopeful. Grace was cleaning the kitchen, wiping down the marble counters. The dim light coming through the glass windows reflected off her calm face. "Mrs. Langley looked at her for a moment and then said softly, "I've never seen anyone here who works as quietly as you. The previous ones used to play music to drown out the silence." Grace smiled, her voice as soft as a breath. "Music cannot soothe fear. Sometimes silence is the only way to make people listen to you." "Mrs." Langley sighed. "I hope you're right. Anyway, you should be careful." "No, could I know?" Grace interrupted, but she didn't seem scared. "I've worked with autistic children, depressed children, abandoned children. Biting isn't out of hate, it's out of fear. The little girl I took care of was like that, biting to keep from crying." "Mrs." Langley was about to ask more, but Richard walked in, looking tired. He had just finished a conference call with his investment team, and his shirt was still wrinkled. He glanced at Grace, then turned to the housekeeper. "Coffee. I left it on the table." "Sir," she replied, quickly leaving the kitchen to avoid the heavy atmosphere that usually arose when Richard was present. Grace continued working, saying nothing. Richard poured coffee, leaned against the counter, and glanced at her. The silence between them was not awkward, but a mutual understanding. This house had had enough of fake noise. He asked softly, "Did the company tell you about Noah?" Grace looked up and replied softly, "A little, but I prefer to know for myself than to hear from others." Richard frowned. "You sound confident." She put down the towel and wiped her hands. "Not really. I just believe that children have their reasons. Sometimes adults are the harder ones to teach." Richard was silent for a few seconds, a look of surprise on his face. He was not used to hearing such answers. Since his wife's death, most people had spoken to him with reserve or pity. She was different, straightforward, calm, not trying to make him feel good. Suddenly, a small sound came from the second floor, a toy falling, then silence. Richard put down his coffee cup. "I'll go check." Grace spoke up. "Can I try?" He turned back, frowning slightly. "No need. The boy is excitable. Strangers frighten him." Grace looked straight at him, her eyes soft but determined. "Mr. Hale, I don't want to interfere, but sometimes fear doesn't go away by avoiding it. It's just, I can sit outside the door. If you don't want to see me, I'll leave." Richard hesitated. His eyes narrowed. Then he nodded. "As you wish." Grace walked up the stairs, each step slowly, as if afraid to disturb the atmosphere. When she reached Noah's door, she stopped and knocked softly. There was no response. She sat down on the floor, leaned against the wall, and took a small flashlight from her pocket. "I used to be afraid of the dark," "Noah," she began softly, her voice even and warm. "I thought there were monsters in the dark. But then I discovered that sometimes it was the light that hurt people because it showed them what they had lost." Silent. Grace turned on the flashlight, shone it on the wall, and drew a fox with her hand. The light moved rhythmically. She smiled softly. "This is my friend. His name is Finn." "Finn doesn't talk. He just likes to listen. I think maybe you and Finn would get along." From inside the room, there was a rustling sound. A small hand reached out, then withdrew. Grace didn't turn around, just continued softly. "I'll leave Finn here. If you want, you can talk to him or throw him away." She placed the flashlight in front of the door and stood up to leave. But as she walked down the stairs, she heard the door open slightly. A small beam of light crept into the hallway. She turned slightly and saw the boy looking after her. Those eyes, big, round, unusually bright in the dim light of the morning. "Good morning, Noah," she said softly. The boy said nothing, just looked at her, then pursed his lips and gave a very small smile, an awkward, crooked smile, but genuine. Richard was standing at the bottom of the stairs, watching it all. That smile made his heart clench. He had waited almost 2 years for it. There was something different about the house after lunch that day. It wasn't exactly a happy one, but it felt like a breath of fresh air was seeping into every corner. Noah agreed to eat with everyone, even though he only ate a few bites and remained silent. He no longer avoided eye contact. Grace told him a short story about Finn the fox who got lost in the woods, her voice light as the wind, natural pauses, full of emotion. Noah stared at the spoon in his hand, his mouth moving as if he wanted to say something. Richard watched silently from the opposite side, his hand clenched on his coffee cup, his heart in turmoil. He did not understand how this woman could make the child he loved the most, but also feared the most, smile after only a few hours. As Noah was being put to bed, he walked over to Grace and asked softly, "How did you do it?" She wiped the table without looking up. "I didn't do anything. I was just there. Children don't need anyone to fix them. They just need to know they're not left behind." Oh, the words made Richard freeze. He remembered the night Elena died. He had rushed to the hospital late and had seen Noah hugging his mother's neck, crying hoarsely. Since then, he had never had the courage to hold his son again. He was afraid he would cause him more pain. Grace stood up, looking at him with calm eyes. "Mr. Hale, maybe what Noah needs most is not a healer, but simply someone who dares to stay." Richard didn't answer. He just watched her as she walked down the hallway, where the first rays of spring sunlight were shining through the frosted glass. In that moment, he knew perhaps this woman would change everything. That night, before going to bed, Richard quietly stopped by his son's room. The boy was already asleep, the flashlight still glowing weakly on the floor. The fox's light was imprinted on the wall, flickering like a dream. He sat down by the bed, gently placed his hand on the blanket, and whispered, "Thank you for smiling today." Down in the kitchen. Grace wasn't sleeping either. She wrote in a small notebook, "First day." He smiled. Just a small smile, but enough to make the whole house breathe. She closed the book and looked out the window, where the rain had stopped. The dim moonlight reflected on the glass, reflecting on her face, containing a deep but peaceful sadness. From that morning on, the Hale mansion was no longer a place filled with the sound of wind and the lonely footsteps of the father. in the early mornings. From downstairs came the small sound of spoons clinking on glasses, Noah's soft laughter, and Grace's steady, warm voice telling stories like breathing. No one knew what had made Noah change so quickly. Maybe it was the light from the small flashlight, maybe Grace's slow voice, or simply the feeling that someone had dared to stay, even though the boy had not said a word. It was a sunny morning in Portland in March. A rare light streamed through the windows, casting a golden glow on the wooden floor. Richard stood by the second-floor balcony, looking down into the living room. Below, Noah sat on the rug, Grace across from him, a stack of old picture books between them. The boy tilted his head to look at the red fox, and Grace read softly, and the little fox said, "I am not afraid of the forest any more, because I have a friend with me." Noah looked up, his dark eyes shining. He said nothing, just smiled, and placed his little finger on the fox. Richard felt his heart tremble. He had read countless medical documents and spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on treatments, but he had never seen that look before. After the story time, Grace led Noah out into the backyard. The small garden was covered with dry leaves, and no one had been there in a long time. The boy clung to her hand, his eyes anxious as he looked out into the unfamiliar space. "It's okay," Grace said softly. "The ground is also afraid of strangers, but when you take your first step, it will greet you with the smell of grass." She took off her shoes, stepped barefoot onto the damp grass, then turned and held out her hand. Noah watched for a few seconds, then stepped down too, slowly and cautiously. When he touched the ground, dry leaves cracked under his feet, making a small crunch. Noah laughed. The laugh was so clear and loud that even Mrs. Langley in the kitchen stopped stirring the soup and looked up to listen. That afternoon, Richard returned from a meeting earlier than usual. He found Grace and Noah coloring on the living room floor. The colors were messy, crayons scattered all over the carpet. He paused. When had he forgotten that this house was meant to be this messy dad's home? Grace said softly. Noah looked up and smiled. It was the first time he'd seen his father in nearly 2 years. Richard stood still, unsure of what to do. Grace nodded slightly, as if encouraging him to move forward. He walked over and sat down beside her, a little embarrassed. "What? Are you drawing?" "Noah." The boy pointed to the drawing, a house with 3 people, a red fox in the middle, and a big orange sun in the background. Richard stared at it for a long moment. His heart sank. That evening, the first meal the 3 of them had together at the same table was quiet, but no longer tense. Noah ate little, but helped himself. Grace told a funny story about the old hospital. Richard just listened, occasionally laughing. Mrs. Langley stood at a distance, both happy and in disbelief. After the meal, Richard poured tea and handed it to Grace. "Thank you," he said. "Not just for Noah, but for this house." Grace smiled. "I'm just doing my job." He looked at her a moment longer. There was something about the woman that calmed him, even though she never said much. Her eyes seemed to understand things he could not put into words. In the days that followed, things began to pick up a new rhythm. Noah woke early, enjoying making pancakes with Grace. Despite burning them several times, he still squealed with delight at the smell of butter. Richard gradually joined in, fumbling with the batter, then bursting into laughter when Noah threw flour in his face. Their laughter made Grace turn away to hide her smile. One afternoon, when it suddenly rained in Portland, they sat in the living room, listening to the rain tapping on the window. Noah lay in Grace's arms, fast asleep. Richard sat opposite, his eyes softer than ever. He said softly, "Have you ever thought that people can be saved just by someone's presence?" Grace looked up, her voice small but firm. "I believe it, because I was saved like that." He didn't ask any more. But that night, he kept thinking about that sentence. What had she gone through to be so gentle now, another morning, as he left for work? He saw Grace hanging Noah's drawings on the hallway wall. The colors were bright. The drawings were silly but cheerful. He stopped and smiled. "Are you doing this for decoration?" Grace tilted her head. "I think the boy should see that his smile has a place to stay, even if it's just on the wall." That sentence made him feel strangely warm inside. He turned away, but as he opened the door and stepped out, he glanced through the glass and saw himself smiling. That was something he had forgotten for a long time. The days passed slowly and peacefully. How Grace occasionally told stories to Noah, while Richard sat nearby reading documents, but his ears still followed her every word. Her voice was soft, sometimes breaking a small beat at the end of a sentence, like a sigh that he did not try to hide. He recognized in her voice the memories of someone who had suffered loss, but still chose to be gentle with the world. One night, after Noah had gone to bed, Richard went down to the kitchen and found Grace setting the table. He poured 2 glasses of wine. She was a little surprised, but did not refuse. "Noah went to bed early today," he said, "probably because I was happy." She smiled. "I said a word today." Richard almost dropped his glass. "What cake?" she replied, her eyes lighting up. "When I asked what he wanted for breakfast tomorrow, just one word, but I think he's coming back." He looked at her, moved beyond words. "Thank you, Grace." She shook her head. "No thanks. Just be there whenever Noah says something. Don't let me talk to air." The sentence was simple, but it was like a needle touching the deepest part of his heart. He nodded slightly, his voice hoarse. "I will try." That night, he stood for a long time by the door of his son's room, listening to Noah's steady breathing. For the first time in years, the house no longer heard crying. There was only the sound of the wind gently rustling the leaves, and somewhere, his own soft laughter. The Hale house, once a prison of sadness, now breathes again, not through music or bright lights, but through small moments. The laughter of children, the clanking of dishes, and the voices of those who thought they had lost faith. Somewhere in that house, Richard knew he was being led out of the darkness, slowly but surely. And the one holding his hand on that journey was none other than Grace, the woman who came in the morning mist, but brought the dawn with her. Portland in April has a deceptive kind of sunshine. The mornings are clear, spring-like, but the afternoons are sudden, rainy, bone-chilling cold. The Hale house is the same way after a string of warm days. A new storm is waiting, not from the sky, but from people. The rumor started with a small article on a gossip site, just a few lines, but enough to spark the fire. Billionaire Richard Hale is living with a woman who has been sued for medical treatment at St. Helena Hospital. She was suspected of injuring children. Now she works in his home, where his young son is. The Post appeared on Monday morning. Richard was at the company office, while Grace took Noah for a walk around the lake near their home. When he received the first message from his colleague Richard, "Look at this. It's going viral." His blood froze. He opened the link. The text was black and bold, and below it was a blurry photo of Grace holding Noah's hand in front of the villa gate. He leaned back in his chair, his mind spinning. Grace, meanwhile, was completely unaware. She sat on a bench by the lake, watching Noah toss dry leaves into the water. With each leaf that floated, he smiled, his eyes shining. She smiled too, feeling strangely peaceful. But that peace only lasted until the phone rang. "Grace, you should go home now." "Mrs. Langley's voice was urgent. "Something's happened." When Grace arrived, several unfamiliar cars were parked in front of the villa gate. Strangers were holding cameras, snapping away as she got out of the car. "Mrs. Langley quickly pulled her inside. "They're looking for Mr. Hale. They're asking who you are." Before Grace could ask anything else, the door opened. Richard walked in, his shirt and tie still undone, his face tired. He looked at her, not exactly angry, but confused. "You read it," she said softly. He nodded. "I'm trying to suppress it, but they won't stop." "What do you want me to do?" "Maybe it's best if you stay away for a while." The remark, seemingly reasonable, left Grace frozen. "Avoiding," she repeated, her voice choked. "Do you think this will help?" Richard didn't dare look directly at her. "It's only temporary. They're digging into your past. If you were here, they'd say I'm hiding something." Grace chuckled, but it was a mirthless laugh. "Hiding I never hid anything from you." "Richard, I told you from the beginning." He was silent. Mrs. Langley, standing nearby, tried to interject Miss Grace. "This is not fair, but Mr. Hale is under pressure. The company lost 2 investors this morning." Grace turned to her eyes softening. "I understand, but perhaps justice never comes early." She turned back to look at Richard. "Do you trust me?" He opened his mouth but couldn't answer right away. His gaze wavered between fear and duty. The room fell silent, broken only by the ticking of the clock. Grace sighed. "No need to say it. I already have the answer." She walked back to her room and began to pack up a few things. The house, already quiet, was now suffocating. "Mrs. Langley stood in the doorway, watching, her eyes red. "You shouldn't leave now. The boy, he needs you." Grace paused and said softly, "I know, but if I stay, people will think Noah needs to be protected from me. I don't want him to grow up thinking that." When she dragged her suitcase down the stairs, Noah was sitting in the living room, holding a small flashlight. He looked up at her, his eyes bewildered. "Where are you going?" he asked in a small voice, his words timid, but clear. Grace paused. It was the first time she had heard Noah speak in full sentences. His childish voice made her heart clench. She knelt down and took the little hand in hers. "I have to go for a little while, Noah, but remember this. Your light depends on no one else. It lies within you." The boy pursed his lips, then suddenly hugged her. Grace held him in her arms, unable to hold back her tears. "I'll come back." "Okay," Noah asked, his voice shaking. Grace nodded. "If you smile, I'll know the way back." Richard stood on the stairs, watching it all. He wanted to step forward, to tell her not to go, that he would protect her, but the words were stuck in his throat. Only when the door closed and the sound of the engine faded did he realize he had just lost something more important than his reputation. That night, Noah refused to eat. He threw his bowl on the floor and screamed for Grace. "Mrs." Langley was horrified. Richard collapsed to his knees, hugging his son. But Noah struggled, clawing at his shirt, tears streaming down his shoulders. "I'm sorry," he said softly. Over and over. I'm sorry, Noah. But the boy did not listen. The house echoed with the cry they thought had left forever. That night, Richard didn't sleep. He sat in his office, the light of the screen shining on his gaunt face. The latest headlines appeared: Grace Miller, mystery woman in billionaire Hale's mansion. He turned off the computer, leaned his head back in his chair, and clenched his fists. Grace's voice echoed in his mind. Don't make me talk to air. He hadn't just let Noah speak to the air. He had let the only person who had brought this house back to life pass away in silence. When dawn broke, he stepped out onto the balcony. It was still drizzling. On the table, the small flashlight Grace had left behind was still there. Dead, no longer lit. He picked it up, looked at the cold steel in his hand, and felt as if he had just snuffed out the only light left in his life. Below, Noah sat on the floor, his eyes red. He held the drawing of the three of them, her, his father, and himself. Richard knelt down, holding his son. I was wrong, he whispered. She wasn't who she said she was, and I didn't dare stand up for her. But that apology cannot erase the void. The Hale house, after months of laughter, was silent again. Everything was as before, except this time it was Richard who heard the silence most clearly. It was like a sentence he had pronounced upon himself. Outside, raindrops fell on the leaves, heavy and cold, and somewhere in the wind, Grace's voice echoed, as soft as a breath. Shutting out the door is also a way to make fear greater. Richard, he understood, and his greatest fear in life was never losing his reputation. It was losing the people who dared to stay when the rest of the world left. The Hale house, after Grace's departure, returned to its original appearance, luxurious, cold, and silent. But now, the silence was no longer a veil to hide sadness, but an open wound that could not be healed. The first morning without Grace, the sunlight streamed through the glass window, shining on the empty chair at the dining table. That chair still had the milk stain Noah had spilled the day before. Grace had tried to wipe it away, but then smiled and said, "Just leave it there. The stain is also a part of the memory." Now, Richard could only look at it as if looking at a vestige of something he could not keep. Noah refused to come down for breakfast. He sat on the stairs, holding the stuffed fox Grace had given him, staring silently at the floor. "Mrs. Langley tried to call out. "Noah, do you want some cake?" No reply. Richard walked over and knelt down in front of his son. He put a hand on his shoulder. "Noah, I'm sorry. Grace is only gone for a while. You have to eat." "Okay." The boy didn't look at him, just shook his head, then whispered, "She didn't come back." His voice was as small as a breath, but it pierced straight into his heart. In the days that followed, Noah returned to his pre-Grace days, quiet, not playing, not sleeping. Every night, he would wake up calling Grace, then burst into tears. Richard held his son in his arms, but a feeling of helplessness surrounded him. He had thought he could buy everything, but now he understood that there was one thing money could not fix: trust. He spent the night looking out into the backyard, where Grace and Noah had played with bubbles. The early May rain was falling lightly, and each droplet hitting the glass reminded him that the silence that day, the moment he didn't answer when she asked, "Do you trust me?" was the moment he lost everything. One morning, he received an email from the board of directors. "The media crisis is over, but your personal image needs to be restored. Please avoid appearing with female employees in the future." He read it and laughed bitterly. Avoid female employees. They didn't know he didn't want to see anyone else anymore. Mrs. Langley saw him holding the picture of the three of them, the one Noah had made, and asked, "Aren't you going to try to find her?" Richard was silent. "I'm afraid, Mrs. Langley, afraid that she won't want to see me. Afraid that if I go, I'll only make things worse." She looked at him a long time, then said slowly, "One fears only when one still has hope. You are not lost yet, Mr. Hale." Those words made him think forever. The next day, Richard took Noah out. They walked along the shore of the lake where Grace had taken him. The water was calm, reflecting the pale sunlight. Noah still held the fox plush, saying nothing. "You miss her a lot, don't you?" Richard asked. He nodded, still looking down at the water. "She said the light was inside me, but I don't see it anymore." Richard knelt down, trying to smile through the tightness in his throat. "Because you haven't opened your eyes yet, the light isn't gone. It's just waiting to be seen again." Noah was silent, then asked softly, "What about Dad? Do you have light?" He paused. A long silence. "Not yet, but I will find it. Thanks to you." It was the first time he spoke honestly about what he wanted to be healed. That night, after putting his son to bed, he opened the notebook Grace had left in the bookcase. The last page had only one short line. "Sometimes staying is brave, but leaving is also a way of loving." He read it over and over again, each word squeezing his heart. For the first time in months, he cried, not because of loss, but because he understood. She left not because she stopped loving him, but because she didn't want to be hurt anymore. In the following days, Richard stopped hiding in his office. He took Noah to kindergarten and attended group therapy. He didn't delegate to his assistant or hide behind a meeting schedule. He wanted to help his son overcome his fear himself. One afternoon, after the therapy session ended, the teacher smiled and said, "Noah drew a smile today." He said it was Miss Grace's smile. Richard laughed with tears falling. That evening, he called an old friend in the media. "I need to find someone," he said. "Grace Miller. No, not for work. I owe her something. No amount of money can repay." "I will help," replied the friend. "But Richard, when you find her, what are you going to say?" He was silent for a few seconds, then replied softly, "I will say thank you for teaching me something I never understood. My whole life, love is not about keeping, but about daring to believe." During the days waiting for news, he and Noah gradually rebuilt their small life. They cooked together and replanted the garden. Every time Noah laughed, Richard could hear Grace's laughter echoing in his memory, clear and gentle as the wind. One evening, while the two were reading, Noah suddenly asked, "Dad, does she remember me?" Richard gently stroked his son's head. "Of course. Someone like Grace doesn't forget the things she's healed." The boy nodded, then fell asleep in his father's arms. That night, it was raining lightly in Portland. Richard went out to the balcony and turned on Grace's old flashlight. He changed the batteries and turned it on. The light was weak at first, then spread, illuminating the wall of the room. The fox appeared again, shaky but clear. He smiled and whispered, "You are right, Grace. The light is still there. You just have to dare to open it." For the first time in months, he didn't feel alone. In that moment, he knew the journey wasn't over, and he would find her again, not out of guilt, but out of true love. The next morning, Richard took Noah to his new school. Before entering the classroom, He turned around and pointed to the sky, Dad. It's sunny today. He looked and nodded. Yes, the sun is shining. Sun. The first light of summer shone through the glass door, reflecting the father's face, no longer cold, but full of life. The Hale house was no longer completely silent. Noah's small laughter echoed through the space, mingling with the birdsong in the garden. The wounds were still there, but there was warmth, and that warmth, though fragile, was enough to signal that the winter in their hearts was slowly melting away. Portland entered summer with sudden showers. The days were sunny. The sun was so bright it touched the eyes. But within a few hours, dark clouds would gather, pouring a persistent, cold, clear rain. In that turbulent city, Richard Hale sat in his car, looking out the windshield, his heart like a mirrored surface, calm, but with hidden waves. It took him nearly 3 weeks to track down Grace's address. When his friend texted him, found it, Riverview Residences, apartment 203. He read it only once, then drove away quietly, telling no one, not even Mrs. Langley. It was raining when he arrived. The driveway to the small, old apartment complex smelled of damp wood and the sound of water running through the tin roof. He turned off the engine and sat still for a few minutes, breathing deeply as if entering some sacred place. He stopped in front of apartment 203. The blue paint was peeling in places. Soft music was playing from inside, probably light jazz. He raised his hand to knock, then lowered it. Hundreds of words ran through his mind, but none of them were enough to start. Finally, he knocked lightly 3 times. There was a pause, then footsteps. The door opened. Grace stood there. Her hair was a little messy. Her sweater was gray. Her face plain and unmade up. Her eyes met his, momentarily surprised, then quiet. "You found me," she said softly. "It took me a while," he replied, his voice low but sincere. There was a long pause. He looked around. The apartment was compact, smelling of coffee and lavender. On the table were a few children's books, a small picture of Noah smiling. He recognized it as a picture taken by Grace, the only one that showed his son looking truly happy. "I don't know where to begin," Richard said. "There's so much I have to say. But maybe the first word should be sorry." Grace bent down, put the teacup on the table, and said calmly, "Sorry can't erase what happened. Richard, I know." He nodded. "But I didn't come here to make excuses. I came because I couldn't keep living like I was right. I stayed silent when I should have stood by you. I was scared, and I lost the 2 most important people in my life." She looked at him, her eyes deep and calm, but hidden with unhealed hurt. "You know, the most painful thing is not the rumor, but when I look into your eyes and see that you don't believe me." Richard took a breath, his eyes welling up with tears. "I believe in you. I just don't believe in myself. I don't believe I'm good enough to keep you." Grace paused at the words. She had not expected the once strong, confident man to speak such soft words. He looked tired, but there was a light in his eyes she had never seen before, the light of someone who had learned to let go of his pride, to hold on to the truth. A clap of thunder sounded outside. Rain began to pour down heavily, pounding loudly on the tin roof. The apartment suddenly felt small amid the deafening noise of the storm. "Did you come here just to apologize?" Grace asked, her voice hoarse. "No." He took a step closer. "I came to say, I can't go on without you and Noah in my life." Grace was silent. He continued, each word clear. You didn't just heal my son. You saved me from myself. You taught me that love isn't about control. It's not about fear of loss. It's about daring to trust. Dare to let someone else into your pain without running away." She turned away, tears falling silently. "You said it well, Richard. But I don't know if we can go back to the way we were. I saw the way you were silent, and I was afraid." He took a step forward, his voice breaking. "I'm scared too. But if being scared makes me lose you again, then I'd rather face it." She looked up, their eyes meeting. Outside, the rain was pounding against the windows, making a dull sound. But inside the apartment, the air was gradually warming. Richard pulled a small object from his pocket, a fox-shaped flashlight. "Noah keeps this every night," he said. "He says if the light goes out, you have to find a way to turn it back on, because Grace will know the way back." Grace looked at the flashlight, then smiled through her tears. That boy always believed more than adults. "And I want to believe it," Richard said hoarsely. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away. But I want to start over, not as a master and a servant, but as two people who have learned to move on from loss." A cold wind blew through the window. Grace stood still, looking at him for a long time. Her eyes were no longer filled with sadness, but also with struggle, between her heart wanting to forgive and her mind wanting to protect herself. "Have you told Noah?" she asked softly. "Okay." Richard smiled slightly. "He just said one thing. If she comes back, I won't bite anyone again." A small, clear laugh escaped Grace's lips. She wiped away her tears. "That boy is so wise." "Like you," Richard replied, "because it learned from you how to love without fear of being hurt." There was another pause. Then she walked over to the window and watched the rain fall like a silver curtain. "Rain in Portland is unpredictable," she said, "like the human heart." "But it stopped," he replied softly. Grace turned back, her gaze warming. "Aren't you afraid I'll leave again?" Richard approached, his voice low but steady. "If you leave again, I will look for you again. As long as I am breathing, I will not let you walk alone, amidst the sound of the rain." She walked slowly towards him, stopping in front of him. They looked at each other, only a small distance. But in that moment, the past, the pain, and all the unspoken words disappeared. She placed her hand on the flashlight in his hand and turned it on. A small light flashed, reflecting on both of their faces. Grace smiled, her voice trembling slightly. "The light is still here," he replied softly, whispering, "and it won't go out again." Outside, the rain had not yet stopped, but the distant sky had a faint streak of light. That light filtered through the glass door, mingling with the small lamp in their hands. Two different lights, but carrying the same message: every rain has an end, and every broken heart can find its way back home. The next morning was a rare clear day in Portland. The ground was still damp from the heavy rain the night before, but the sky had opened, and the first rays of summer sunlight shone down on the steaming rooftops. The silver car stopped in front of the Hale mansion. The engine stopped, and for a moment everything seemed to stand still. The tall iron gate, which had not opened for a long time, made an old but strangely gentle sound. Grace got out first. She held a small cloth bag in her hand. Her beige sweater hugged her slim body, and the gentle wind blew her hair. Inside the car, Noah was pressing his face against the window, his eyes wide and eager. When the door opened, he jumped up and ran out, shouting, "Miss Grace." She bent down, opening her arms. Noah threw himself into her embrace as if afraid she would disappear again. She held him tight, his warmth radiating like the sun. They said nothing for a few seconds, just the sound of the wind in the trees and the beating of their hearts. Richard stood a few paces away, watching them. The light reflected off his face, highlighting his softened eyes. There was no fear in his gaze, only gratitude and peace. "I miss you so much," Noah said softly, his voice breaking. Grace smiled, placing her hand on the boy's cheek. "I missed you too. Look, you've grown. Dad told me to eat a lot so she would be surprised when she got home," Noah said, proudly showing off. All three laughed. It was the first time in a long time that laughter had echoed through the Hale gates. Inside, the house was the same. White walls, wooden staircase, old picture frames. But something was different. The air felt lighter, brighter, as if the house itself knew what it had been waiting for had returned. "Mrs." Langley emerged from the kitchen, surprised to the point of tears. "Oh my God, Grace, you're really back." Grace smiled. "I think it's time to go home." She stepped forward and took her hand. "You will always have a place here. This house will miss you." Richard put his hand on her shoulder, his voice warm, "And so do I." They sat together in the living room. Grace brewed chamomile tea on the table, a familiar scent that had been missing for months. Light filtered through the curtains, illuminating all three of their faces. Noah sat in the middle, his eyes shining. "Are you still angry with Dad?" the boy asked innocently. Grace smiled softly. "I was never angry. I just needed time for him to learn to listen." Richard bowed his head, his voice low. "And I'm still learning. But if you allow me, I want to learn for life." Noah tilted his head, curious. "What are you studying, Dad?" Richard smiled. "Learn to love truly, like you love Grace." The boy nodded as if he understood. "Then you have to be good. Dad, don't drop out of school halfway." The whole room burst into laughter. The clear laughter echoed down the hallway, up the stairs, into every dark corner that had long been filled with dust and memories. In the afternoon, they went to the backyard, where Grace had taught Noah to blow bubbles. The grass was soft and green, and rosebuds were beginning to bloom. The boy ran around, holding the new tube of bubbles, blowing sparkling circles into the sky. Richard and Grace sat side by side on the wooden bench. "You replanted the roses?" she said softly. "Yes. They didn't open at first, probably because I didn't have your hand." Grace looked at the petals swaying in the wind, her eyes shining with emotion. "They are alive now, like us." She turned to look at him. The sunlight fell on his face, highlighting the small wrinkles at the corners of his eyes. He no longer looked like the cold billionaire who had feared being hurt, but a man who had learned the value of loss and forgiveness. "You said you didn't know where to start," she said softly. "Do you know now?" Richard held her hand, his eyes determined. From this very moment, not to fix the past, but to continue writing the future. Noah ran over and climbed into their laps. "Stay here. Don't go." Grace hugged the boy and looked up at Richard. "If I stay, can I choose my own role?" He nodded without hesitation. "You don't have to be anyone else. You just have to be Grace, the one who brought light back to this house." She smiled, a real smile, no longer shy. "Then I will stay. Not out of pity, but because this place is worthy of love." The western sky glowed a warm orange. The last bubbles rose, reflecting the afternoon sun, breaking into tiny specks of light. That evening, Their first dinner together was accompanied by soft music. Noah sang softly. Mrs. Langley served his favorite stew, and Richard and Grace looked at each other, smiling silently. While Noah slept, the two of them went out onto the porch. The city in the distance was lit up with lights. The wind carried the scent of lavender. I used to think every sad story ended in loss, Richard said softly. But maybe some losses are the way we find the right people, Grace replied, her voice soft as a breath. No one is perfect, Richard, but the one who dares to admit his mistakes and change, that is the one who is strong enough to love. He turned and took her hand. Thank you for coming back. She smiled softly. It's not me who came back. It's the house that opened its door. They stood there under the stars. The light from inside the house shone through the window, warm and gentle. Noah's laughter drifted down the stairs like a lullaby. For the first time in years, Richard felt like the house was truly alive. No longer a place of sadness, but a home that could breathe, that could love, that could forgive. He turned to Grace, his voice low enough for only her to hear. The house is laughing again. See, Grace leaned on his shoulder and whispered, because finally, we learned to smile through tears. Outside, the wind blew through the rose garden, causing petals to fall gently onto the stone steps. One petal landed on her hand, soft pink as a promise. It was the moment the Hale house was truly reborn, not by wealth, but by love and faith, reborn from the brokenness. The story, Every Nanny Quit. After the millionaire's son bit them. But then he smiled at One Maid is not only about a boy and a maid, but also a mirror reflecting the wounds in each person. There are pains that make us close our hearts, but there are also people who appear at the right time, patient enough to warm that cold heart. Richard Hale, the successful father, learned that love does not need power to prove itself, but trust to survive. Grace Miller, the little woman, teaches us that sometimes just staying and listening can save a soul. The story ends with laughter, not of victory, but of healing. In life, everyone has experienced loss and fear when opening their hearts, but if we are brave enough to believe in the good, then the light, no matter how small, will return, illuminating the darkest corners of us. Thank you for joining Frontier Hearts on this journey. If the story makes you smile, warms your heart, please like, share the video to spread the beauty, and subscribe to Frontier Hearts, where each story is not only about love, but also reminds us that there is always hope, even when we have been hurt.